Before I get started on the topic, I just wanted to introduce myself for those of you who don't know me or who I haven't met before. So, as I said, I'm Allegra Spender. I'm the member for Wentworth. I grew up around here. I grew up in Woollahra. I live in Darling Point. I lived about 10 years overseas. Otherwise, I have only lived in Wentworth, which makes me very parochial, but it means that, my family is here. I went to Ascombe Local School, and I have had a varied career. I started out in consulting. I studied economics, started out in consulting, then worked in Kenya for a not-for-profit, worked in the health system in the UK, ran my family's fashion business, ran a not-for-profit in education, and then for the last 3 years have been the member for Wentworth. Why one thing is really about, I always like to say, so why did I get into politics? I didn't expect to. I actually didn't think politics was a place for someone like me because I try to be pretty rational, I try to be pretty level-headed and really calm. And I looked at the television, I thought, wow, how do people behave? It's appalling. But I got involved in politics because, I believed very strongly, I think, in the values of this community. The community I've grown up in, the community which I think has enormous compassion, is also hard-headed and holds people accountable, and also wants to be good stewards for coming generations. And it was really around those values, which I felt were missing in our representation, that really made me get into politics. And part of it is also, with any person, it is also a little bit, well, not just a little bit, I think, how you approach things is a lot about your parents and family. And, my father was actually a politician as well. And what I took from him was that sense of service, and that we all have an obligation to be the change we want to see in the world. He was also a very courteous man, and I think, again, that is something that we don't see enough in politics. But I also took a lot from my mum, who was a fashion designer, came to Australia when she was just 11 years old, didn't speak any English, and started her own business. And her life, particularly that she was a successful person, despite not having wealth behind her or having people behind her, she was successful, has made me very passionate about making sure that this country continues to be a place where everyone can thrive, regardless of their background, but also where businesses can start and grow. Well, that's enough about me. I can talk about tax reform and climate change, and I'm sure we'll get to some of these questions. But I really came here to talk about the topic I was given was Vote 2025, what's loving thy neighbour got to do with it? Now, I was tempted to, dissect the political campaigns of everybody through this and prove that other people weren't loving their neighbours as much as they should have. But I'm resisting that because I think that's not actually the spirit of the question. What I wanted to really cover is not so much the last election, but more broadly what in politics, how does loving thy neighbour matter in politics? And, is it important? Is it relevant at all? And, I want to say that loving thy neighbour goes to the heart of the kind of society we want to build and the kind of leadership we want to see. So for me, loving thy neighbour has everything to do with politics. And I think that it is honestly a piece that too many politicians forget. If you think about politics, in any healthy democracy, politics should be more than just about power or partisanship or polling. At its best, politics, I believe, is about service. And I think while a lot of people are cynical about politicians, I believe that many people that I meet in politics and actually in public life still have that strong sense of service within them. Though, I'll be honest, I think it gets clouded, with ego, with sort of desire to protect themselves and, with vested interests in others. But that sense of service, I think, is pretty profound. When you think of what is politics itself, it is about coming to make decisions that affect not just ourselves, but each other, our neighbours, our community, and our country. And that is an inherently moral undertaking, the service of politics. And now, love thy neighbour is one of the oldest moral instructions that we have. Whether you come from a faith tradition or not, it is an idea that we have a duty of care outside of our own selves, our own families, and is core to many of the world's ethical traditions. So if we accept that politics is a type of public decision making and that public decisions affect the well-being of others, then the call to love thy neighbour and to act with care, compassion and conscience is not just peripheral to politics, it's absolutely central. People often ask me, what most surprised you about political life? There are a lot of candidates, things like how loud the shouting is in the Chamber of Parliament. But actually the biggest surprise to me was not the difficult moments of politics, but was actually the joy of doing the job. And the joy of doing the job, so much of that joy for me personally has come from this community and watching Loving Thy Neighbour in practice and being inspired by that. A very profound moment for me in my time as a politician was when a woman came to me, one of our local constituents, she came to me and she said, I have been supporting refugees for many years, I've been visiting refugees in Villawood, and she said, there is a man, Saeed Amassi, he has the longest standing asylum seeker in Australia who's been locked up. He's been locked up for 13 years. Would you like to FaceTime him? So we sat in my office in Edgecliff and we FaceTimed Saeed. And it was, I don't think I'll ever forget that day, because both this woman who had shown so much care of someone she never knew, but had shown so much care and compassion about someone who was going through such difficulty. But also from Saeed, despite being locked up by Australian society for 13 years, his desire to contribute and make a wonderful contribution to this country. And one of the most profound joys I had in my life, in this political life, was to meet Saeed 2 days after he was freed from immigration detention, and when he was able to join the community properly. And I think that the compassion and the care shown by that woman to advocate for someone that she has no personal connection to, but recognise the inherent injustice of his situation, is some of the sort of things that inspire me. I spend a lot of time with volunteer groups, things like the surf clubs and the sort of different faith groups, but also in schools. And it's the volunteering that I see, which is also really inspires me and gives me a great deal of joy. It's watching people getting joy from watching other people do things they never thought they could do. You see that a lot in the surf clubs, inspiring young women to, go out there and drive those, surf rescue boats when, young women certainly didn't used to do that. Seeing how people get the joy from giving, and how that actually, as they say, giving is its own reward. It actually gives more to the giver. That is what has inspired me most in politics, and that is what I have seen so much in Wentworth. Finally, to that point of reflecting on the Bondi Junction tragedy we had, I think about this community at that point where we had someone who was seeking to hurt, violently hurt as many people as he could. And then you had so many people in our community trying to prevent that, trying to look after each other, people they never knew and that would never move again. And so again, even in moments of tragedy, it is, I think, the compassion and conscience that the people of Wentworth have that gives me the greatest joy, and also the greatest pride. Now, sometimes people say, well, that's, of course we do this at this local level, but when it comes to money, when it comes to those sorts of questions, that's where loving thy neighbour stops. And I've said, look, that is not always the case, and that certainly hasn't been the case here in Wentworth. Where I believe people have the capacity to make, to give, and that includes, decisions, that they are willing to be they're willing to look beyond their selfish interests. I think this is a mistake in politics where we assume the only way to get something done is appeal to people's selfish interests. But to give you an example, there was a change in the stage 3 tax cuts, if anyone's been following that. And there were many people in this electorate who were disadvantaged actually by that change. Many people benefited, many people disadvantaged by it, or some people disadvantaged by it. And I remember standing in Bondi Junction asking people what they thought about it. And this man came up to me and he said, I'm going to be worse off, so is my wife, but I think this is the right thing for the country because I think other people need this more than I do, and this is the right thing. And I was really inspired by that selflessness. Now, we don't all, and that was financially, that was literally money that he was handing, saying, I support you, supporting this money going not to me, but to somebody else. And I think there are circumstances where that's not possible, but I do think that in many cases we do think, and we should be thinking of the broader good as well as the individual, in our individual concerns. I get it. We are a relatively wealthy electorate, though the wealth is not equally shared, and there's more disadvantage here than people realise. But I hear often from people who say, "Look, I'm going to be okay. My kids are going to be okay, but I worry that other people, that other people's kids who don't get help with houses or don't have the advantages that I'm able to give to my kids. I'm worried about them." And I think that is that spirit of loving thy neighbour, and I certainly see that a great deal in our community. And I think we need to reflect on, firstly, what happens if we don't have that? What happens if we don't have that spirit of loving thy neighbour, even when at times, we do put our own interests above others, and that is something that does happen, significantly, and it's not necessarily wrong. You do see politics that is transactional, divisive, and short-term, and where fear really replaces care for others. And I think in that society, we all suffer. You see the rise of cruelty. You see the rise of communities pitted against each other, saying, the reason why you've got problems is because them. You need to know who to hate. And I think that is an incredibly destructive force in politics, but it is there. And political parties, individuals seek to mobilise that fear for political advantage, which is really incredibly difficult because because sometimes you can't love your neighbour. And I think of a woman I know who was had enormous fear for herself and her family. And, we were talking about this fear, and we were also talking about other people who were in difficult situations. And she said, look, I just don't think I've got the compassion right now to worry about somebody else. I am so worried about my family, I don't have the compassion. And I thought that was a very honest thing to say, that in times of enormous stress, whether it be financial stress, fear for being able to preserve the life that you want, for your kids to go to the school, for you to be able to retain your house, things that matter to you, to retain your position. At moments of fear and stress, we really struggle to love thy neighbour. And that, I think, is a human reaction. So therefore, we need to consider how do we deal with those moments. I think the other part of some of the challenges of loving thy neighbour is in diversity. We have now, Australia is probably one of the most diverse countries, not just now, that has ever been. We have never had in the history of the world as countries of so many ethnic, religious backgrounds of such diversity ever. We've never tried to make such diversity work, and it is a challenge. And that is, again, where fear can really play in terms of people's ability to love thy neighbour. I was actually speaking to a university vice-chancellor, and he was saying, there are many people who are concerned about the rise of international students and the impact that has on the housing market. Now, this is a legitimate concern that people can have, but he said in some cases this has turned into real hostility and anger towards international students. That again this is where the sort of politics has transformed what is an issue into hatred and has been mobilised for political gain, and that is completely destructive. So I think this comes to the question that I think is really important, which is how do we preserve loving thy neighbour, and balancing the love of thy neighbour with own self-interest in complex communities at times where people are under stress. What can we do to do this? Both what can we as individuals do and what can we as a society do? And there are three things that I really think about. And the first one is one that I always say to every single new citizen when I do the citizenship ceremonies. I say, that loving thy neighbour starts with building understanding. And I think that the first piece is really how do we build understanding of others, because the people we fear are not the people who are closest to us. They're often external. So there is a great book called The Great Experiment, How Do You Make Diverse Democracies Work? And one of the points that this book makes, which is that you really, societies where people of different faiths, backgrounds, ethnicities work side by side, have meaningful relationships as equals with each other, that reduces prejudice. That actually can eliminate prejudice, because people have that lived experience of someone who is different to them, and that is really important. But that also means building understanding even when we disagree. I think one of the most challenging things in this community and around Australia has been the war in the Middle East, and how that has divided people's perspectives and how strongly felt some of those different views are. So many people have loved ones in the conflict that is going on right now, and feel deeply that hurt and pain and fear for their families, and that has been incredibly difficult to deal with. And I've spoken to some Jewish faith leaders who are engaging, with other Jewish leaders and Jewish people, with members of the Muslim and Palestinian communities. And he was saying, this man was telling me about how it is incredibly confronting to sit there and listen to somebody else's perspective on a war that you feel deeply about, and hear a side of things that you don't agree with, but that he is continuing on that work, because they may never convince each other that they're wrong or do have a different view, and I think they probably won't. I don't think you can only listen only with a goal to convince somebody that they should think what you think. It is that starting with listening and building understanding that helps build compassion with others, even when you continue to disagree. And I think that is got to be the heart of what we do. This is hard to do in a society dominated by social media and very fast pace. And I think credit to all of you who have rejected that temptation to sit in front of your phone and watch 30-second reels, but instead come here tonight and have more of a debate. But it is that person-to-person piece that builds understanding, and I think allows us to love thy neighbour as ourselves. The second piece is built. Is really a build on that, I think, which is to say, even if you don't love your neighbour as yourself, be aware that if we let groups of people suffer in this society, this whole society will be worse off. And I think that's the selfish reason to love your neighbour as yourself. But truthfully, when I look at what has happened in the US, when I look at Donald Trump and his rise, I think a lot about people in the US who just felt they had no chance. They had no hope. Their lives, when they look forward and the lives of their kids, they did not see their lives getting better. And there were some people who were doing absolutely fine, really, really thriving. But the problem is, if you leave people behind, if people don't have hope, if you don't have a society that creates hope and opportunities for all, things will fall apart. The centre will not hold. And I think that is what has happened in the US. So even if you don't love your neighbour as yourself, if there are parts of our community that are really struggling, that are not, that we see, perhaps it's, they do not have opportunities. They do, and it doesn't seem fair to them. That is going to be a problem for all of us. It may not be a problem next week, next year, but it will be a problem. And we, selfishly need to look in our political spectrum of how things affect us, not just personally, but how they affect the whole of society, because we all need to thrive if this country will continue to be as strong as it is. And then finally is a question on accountability. I was thinking about this idea of loving thy neighbour as thyself. And there is, to love and how you think of your own self-love, there is compassion, but there is accountability. You can't, I try not to love myself without, holding myself accountable to things, because I think, people we love, we want good things for them, but we also want them to be good. And I think that final piece is about, is what I think everyone can do, and what I ask of everyone of me, which is hold government accountable to how it acts, to the services it provides, to how effective it is. Because again, if people have have services, have care, are successful, if governments are good at doing what they're meant to do and actually deliver their promises, again, that reduces fear, it reduces trauma and uncertainty, and that actually makes us a stronger society as well. So to love thy neighbour as thyself, I think that is about, building understanding, but it is also about walking in other people's shoes and making sure you vote on the basis of other people's experiences. And finally, it is about love and accountability in terms of how you hold government to account, but also what you expect of each other. So this is what I just wanted to say. I've gone longer than I thought I would, but just wanted to really share some of my thoughts on this. I know we'll get to talk about policy issues in specifically, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk about loving thy neighbour as thyself, because it is a profound concept, and it is one that in politics, so much what goes on in Canberra is so distant to the humanity that we show in our community. And I think for me, that is one of my missions actually in politics, is to bring some of the compassion and care and accountability that this community shows into politics and into the real world of what goes on over there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allegra. Don't go away.
Don't go too far.
Congratulations, as I said, on your reappointment for another term. As you look back at your first term, these are two questions. The first one is, what are the things that you look back with great satisfaction? And particularly thinking about our theme, about loving neighbour, as you look back and think, wow, I'm really, not proud, wrong word, but satisfied about the contribution that I've made.
Mm-hmm. I'll stop here. There are a few things. I didn't talk much in my speech about climate action, but one of the reasons I got into politics was to take climate action. And I believe why I was doing that is very much from a point of view of loving thy neighbour as myself. And I think this community has cared about the environment, both because of our care of our local natural world, but because we care about future generations, and we care about those people who are experiencing fires and floods and droughts, not here in Wentworth, but are experiencing those things, and recognise that impact is sincere. So what I'm proud of, and pride is a sin, but what I am satisfied is to have made a contribution on climate action in terms of strengthening legislation, pushing the government to go further on things like bringing in fuel efficiency, but also in helping make sure that we have things like more community batteries and programs that help households manage the cost of energy as well as do the right thing for the planet. So trying to find that win-win for those people who are under really significant financial pressure, that they can do the right thing for the environment without feeling like they're unable to.
Great, thank you. Now, the flip side of that question, what are the things that you are either disappointed or frustrated by that you were unable to achieve?
Well, I'm going to start with one which is possibly more, like I've been a big advocate for tax reform. I didn't get it done in last term, but I think there's a great chance we might do some this term because the Treasurer just announced that today, or not today, but yesterday, that he was interested in that. So that was really, really positive. I think the areas that I guess I think is work that is not yet finished is certainly some work around helping young people have the same outcomes and milestones as their parents. I think this is very difficult, but I do think that young people can't access housing and can't access childcare and other things the way their parents did. To give you an example, I was on King's Cross on the weekend, and this young woman came up to me, and she was pushing a pram with twins, and her husband was just there with a 3-year-old. I was like, oh my gosh, you guys got your hands full. She's a doctor at St. Vincent's. She actually treated my mother, and she told me her story, which was that she was a nurse, then she retrained to be a doctor. Her husband was a policeman, he retrained to be a lawyer. They're young, they've been trying to save for a house the whole time. They're now in their sort of mid-30s. They've got, I feel like this is going a bit and forth. They've got 3 kids, and they just can't see a way to having their own home. And she said, I think about it every single day. And that I find, and she said, look, I feel like I've made all the right choices. And, she has. And she's also doing something genuinely trying to help the world. And she says, I'm well paid, but I just can't find my way through this. And so I think that helping each generation thrive is really, really important. And, to come back to that point on Trump, if we don't help our next generation thrive, we will all not only morally be worse off, but I think as a society, we will be less secure. So I think there is a long way to go, I think both on housing and it's related to tax reform. There's probably, area that is just really hard.
I want to take the conversation to loving our Indigenous brothers and sisters. What do you think are perhaps next steps after the failure of the voice? Where to from here?
And firstly, I do want to acknowledge, your role and the role, of so many people in this room, including many of my volunteers who drove the campaign for the voice in this area. But also to recognise, I'll be honest, that if you care about Indigenous Australians, that doesn't, if you didn't vote for the voice, it doesn't mean that you don't care. And I think that's something that we lost in that debate, was that sense that people can have different views without wishing anyone else ill. This is really hard. Again, this is probably, I think, was a great disappointment to me. And I think the truth is that many of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people I know are still reeling from the impact of that, of the referendum. And I think many of the leadership, this was their life's work and it didn't happen. And so I think we have had a massive setback. So I think where we go from here, it should, what was the aspiration of the voice was both philosophical but also practical. The goal was to deliver better services to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people by listening to them, and that is something that we can do and still need to do, just with different sort of ways. So I think those practical pieces, I think, is where the government is focused at the moment, and it's where we really need to see results because we haven't. That broader philosophical piece, is the missing one. And I think we probably, my belief is we need to go to truth telling. Even watching my kids at school, the amount of understanding they have to Aboriginal history compared to what I do as what I got, at least when I was at school, is remarkable. But I think it's many of the adults who need to hear the truth, and that is a place to build from. So I think building on the truth, building on the institutions that deliver that, continuing to do things like the frontier wars and those sorts of pieces that help build that understanding. I think that is a really important place to start. And then just local. We now in Wentworth actually have, because we now have Woolloomooloo, we actually have many more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our community in the electorate than we ever did before. And I think that's an enormous opportunity for us as a community to just build understanding, because certainly in my experience, I didn't know anyone who was Aboriginal until my 20s. And that's, that means that you don't have that chance to build, and I think many of our kids don't either.
Thank you. Now, you did touch on this in what you said earlier, but I'd like to think about our neighbours overseas, and what does it mean to love them, both those who are in the midst of conflicts, and there's obvious questions about those seeking asylum or refugee, but loving people with diametrically opposed views. Now, you have touched on this, but do you want to just expand on that?
Yeah, sure. I'd say probably... So this, again, we're talking about really all the challenges, I think the challenging topics. It is really hard because, we have, for instance, in this community, we have the biggest Jewish community in the country. We also have an incredibly progressive community who are, in many cases, very aligned to the Palestinian cause. So we have had so much correspondence and interaction with people who feel very, very differently. And that is, I think, exacerbated by what is happening online, and sometimes is exacerbated by politics. And so how to manage this? I think, I feel in this, some moments I've done it well and some moments I've done it really badly. And I think what I try and do when I'm doing it well is to come back to what are our common values. And I think our common values are that, we as a society, want the safety of safety and security of others. And I think we want that for neighbours overseas as well as locally. We believe that I think we as a country eschew violence, and particularly violence against civilians. And we, those are sort of values I think we hold dear. And we believe that aid needs to get to those who need it. And then, so you've got to come back to, I think, that principles piece, because, there are many things that are happening that, have really, I think, violate those principles, or that we're really struggling with. But I think it's, if we keep on coming back to those principles, is the way to wake through. I think at the same time, it's just realise that there's a huge amount of complexity in terms of how do you achieve that? And where I often come out is to say, I believe that most people in our community want the same thing. It's just that we have different views on how that can be achieved. Whether that is through trying to eliminate Hamas and do that through a war, or whether that is through more diplomatic means. And I think that's trying to go. You can say, well, if we agree on the goal, then we're arguing about the means to achieve that goal. And I think that is a start to build common ground. But this is really hard, and this, I think, has it's taxed me more than probably anything else. And still, I'm sure I will continue throughout my life to question what I've done and what I haven't done in this space. But I think it is then also coming back to this community and how to make sure that Australia continues to be a place that treats people as individuals, not as people who, we inherently recognise that you are more than your religion, your ethnicity, your sexuality. You are of inherent value in yourself. And I think, coming back to that and stopping the sort of labelling and demonising of the other is also at the heart of it. And that is why I've been extremely strong in terms of fighting anti-Semitism, but also fighting other types of racism, including racism against Muslim people, because you none of that is acceptable, and that's not going to work in this country either, because we are too diverse a country to allow that wars overseas to really fracture our society, because it's a great danger to us.
You mentioned that Wentworth has perhaps more pockets of disadvantage and certainly economic and socioeconomic diversity than we might realise. Are there particular, what the question behind my question is, what can we do locally to love our neighbour? So where have you seen encouraging things happening locally where people are altruistically, not out of self-interest, loving one another in really powerful ways?
Look, I think it is. I think really everywhere. I guess, and I am really inspired across our community on this. Where do we have disadvantage? We have more disadvantage, particularly in Woolloomooloo, in parts of the Cross, and there are wonderful organisations that are very that are deeply embedded in those communities, such as Wayside Chapel, Matthew Talbot, and many other sort of institutions. And I know that there are lots of volunteers, probably volunteers in the room here, who make who actually make a huge difference in those communities. I think there's both that local element. So I still come to actually. We also have hard days, and even if we're not disadvantaged in a particular moment, we all face moments of health of loss, and I think that as well as financial loss. And I think some of how we love our neighbours is actually just the care and compassion that we show people in those situations. And that's I was just talking to one of the surf clubs actually this week, and he was saying there was someone who had been through an incredibly traumatic experience and needed a type of healthcare that wasn't covered, and the surf club came together to say, give this person money. So I think it's not just people on the streets; it's people that sometimes that are going through those hardest pieces. But I think it is also making sure that we do look outside of just this area. So we are more varied than we look, but we are still relatively very advantaged. So I think it is still building relationships with other churches, other groups. I mean, how have you seen it? I should ask you this question, Michael. What's where do you see this? Where are you most inspired, and where do you think the opportunities are?
Good attempt to turn the question back on me, but I want to redirect the question back on you, which is what do you see the role of the for-profit sector? Not necessarily the religious for-profit, although obviously I'm interested in that one, but generally, like we have government, we have private sector, but then we have the kind of third sector, the whole and I know you have a background. For purpose. Yes, and so how do you see that? Its contribution in loving neighbour?
I think it's enormous, but I also think it doesn't. I think you're loving your neighbour. You can love your neighbour whether you're in a business or in a not-for-profit, and that's for me. I don't. I've never been someone who says, "Oh, look, you work in business. Oh, you only care about making money. You don't care about community or making a difference." I think you can do both. And I also think, I'll be honest, that there are some people or some organisations that are not-for-profit that don't actually deliver service and value to the community. So I think you kind of have to judge each on really what they're doing. I've run not-for-profits. I've worked in not-for-profits, and I think they can be incredibly valuable in mobilising communities and creating change. But also you can do that in the for-profit, and I'll give you an example. I used to run this education charity, Australian Business Community Network. We were a not-for-profit, a network of over 200 low socioeconomic schools and 45 big businesses, like banks and Microsoft and and what we did in this job was the companies paid us as a not-for-profit to run programs with kids from these schools, where we brought these kids into their workplaces. The volunteers from these organisations came and talked to people about their jobs and helped develop skills and capabilities so that these kids, were being mentored by people from the business world and were more able to access careers that they never thought was possible. So this is the companies not only paid for the paid a not-for-profit, they paid the not-for-profit for the privilege of their staff volunteering for us, and it was wonderful. So I think I think it's up to, I don't think companies can let themselves off the hook to say, well, I'm a for-profit, therefore I don't have to do good in the world. And I think also, not-for-profits also need to make sure that just because you're not-for-profit doesn't mean, you are delivering enough good in the world. We always have to hold ourselves to hold ourselves accountable and say, are we doing as much as we could?
Good evening, I'm Bernard Stewart, I'm from St. George's. I do want to thank Allegra first off. I have to say, Allegra, the first time I met my MP, I was in my early 30s, a young medical researcher, and was coerced into a group of 3 that met our local MP to, of course, plea for more money for medical research. Good old self-interest, front and centre. And I remember vividly, in the course of the conversation with this MP, I suddenly became aware this was not an intelligent human being. And I wasn't angry, I just had a sense of outrage. How can I possibly say this man represents me? And I was just trying to contend with that well above trying to point out to him how value for money medical research is. Now, I want to say that in sharp contrast, hearing you elucidate what's loving my neighbour got to do with it, and hearing your concern, and hearing the values you espoused and the issues you addressed, I am very pleased that you are my MP. And that applause, I can't necessarily repeat that applause, it was just supposed to come at the... So I was going to say, and I'm sure there are many people in this room who are pleased that you are their MP, and there may even be a few of people in this room who live further away who wish that you were their MP. So it's lovely that you are here, and it's lovely that you're able to meet with us. And Allegra's indicated she will be here having a coffee, so you could begin your weekend conversation with your friends by saying, as I said to my MP the other day. So brilliant. I also want to thank Michael, our bishop. It's difficult to explain, those of you who are not perhaps familiar with the ins and outs of Anglicanism or even Christianity, the key role that a bishop plays. And a person like me has to tread very carefully when dealing with the bishop. So when I very carefully said we hope to have Allegra Spender along talking to a group, and would you possibly in principle think you might be able to be present? He said something along the lines, not a problem, great idea. Wait till I get my diary, I'll give you some dates. So Michael is here with enthusiasm. We at St. George's value Michael's engagement with our community. Please join me in thanking Michael for... And finally, I just want to say some brief word about the community here at St. George's. As Allegra correctly pointed out, Christianity hasn't got some unique claim on loving your neighbour. Many religious groups affirm that, perhaps all faiths affirm that. And beyond faith, many non-faith communities, humanitarian groups, service groups or whatever, certainly affirm concern for other people. There's fortunately, no monopoly on that care. But we at St. George's are not concerned with how many other people love their neighbour. We're concerned with doing our best to do so. We believe that those words as spoken by Jesus give us an imperative to do better, to take an interest in and to support fully our neighbours, and we do various things exemplified by supporting women who are subject to domestic violence. But we also hope to have talks that we call peace talks. That's an acronym for political, ethical, artistic and cultural engagement talks, and we hope to have more talks like this so that we can explore, so far as St. George's is concerned, how we can best support other people and show that love that we happen to believe Jesus showed us. So thank you for being here. The coffee is very good, and please stay. It's not often we get a chance to talk to one another in community, but if you've never thought of talking to one another, think of it as just Facebook being live. And so, a good evening. Thank you for coming, and do join us for coffee.